Hey everybody, it's Crindle7 here, and welcome to the basics of working with leatherwork. If you want to skip the basics and go straight to the second part of this video, which is how to make a sheath, then I will put a subtitle on this now. Just go to the time that it says, and you'll be able to skip all this. This is literally the basics of what you will need, how to, sew it, like the different types of stitches, that kind of thing. So, the first thing you'll need, technically, one of the first things you'll need is a needle and thread. If you're doing this for the purposes of Viking Re-enactment, that kind of thing, this needle isn't authentic. It's an actual leather needle. It's not made of leather, obviously. It's a needle for sewing through leather and that kind of thing, but it's not actually authentic. So you don't have to use an authentic one, obviously, for sewing it, but if you're doing it on display at a living history event, you will want to get yourself one of those. They're not that expensive. And the other thing is this. This is actually leather thonging. It's advised that you get I think it's 0.7mm, sorry, that's the one. Yeah, it's advised that you get, like, I don't know, 1mm thick, that kind of thing. But yeah, this is slightly thinner than the stuff that I normally use, but it doesn't really make a difference. Yeah, I'll put the actual measurement that you need on screen because, frankly, I cannot remember anything today. So, yeah, leather thonging. It's fairly cheap. You can get it for about £2.30 for however many meters, quite a few meters. Then you'll need your bradawl. You'll want to keep it in a cork or something of that kind of thing, because obviously it is sharp. It's also handy to keep your needle in as well, if you have one. If you have a cork, obviously, keep your needle in it, and keep your bradawl in it, and it just keeps it all together, and stops the points from sticking into things. Again, if you're doing this for the purposes of Viking Re-enactment, this bradawl is authentic. That's antler handle. It is authentic, however corkscrews obviously are not. So if you are at a show, you'll want to keep the cork hidden under some furs or whatever during the show when the public are wandering around. In case you don't know what a bradawl is, this is for making the holes in the leather, because sewing with leather is different from sewing with material, because the needle will not just go through the leather. Some thinner leathers it will, but this is fairly thin leather that will not go through, and if you're using an authentic needle, that will just snap the needle. So you need to make the hole first, then put the needle through later. As you may have seen if you watched my first video about sheath making, which I will put a link to in the description. The main problem with bradawls is sticking them in your fingers. You'll be trying to push it through a bit of leather, suddenly it'll go through unexpectedly and it will go into your finger. Same with the needle, that happens as well. I would say be careful, but I'm going to say try and avoid it, because it's going to happen. Sod's law says it's going to happen. It's an occupational hazard, really, with working with leather or any kind of sewing. It just happens. So just be careful. You're not really going to damage yourself too badly, because you shouldn't be pushing that hard anyways, because in that case the leather's really thick, which means you need to be incredibly careful with it, and anyone who is pushing really hard on leather that thick is just stupid, really. It's kind of common knowledge that you're not going to jam it in, because when it goes through it will go like that, and you'll put it straight through your finger. So you want to be very careful with that. But apart from that, it's just, you know, little jabs and stuff. It won't do too bad. Worst case scenario, it's going to bleed for a bit. That's about it. So that's all the materials you'll need, apart from obviously the leather. Now, I will be making a sheath later on in this video, and I will probably be using leather that is more like this kind of thickness, because I don't actually have any thick leather at the moment. It is advised to make sheaths out of thick leather that's maybe 5mm, something like that, because it will hold its shape a lot easier, and it's just basically stronger and, you know, more convenient all round, really, more practical, I mean. But the making process is the same, and I won't be making this sheath to use, so I don't really need it to work. So I'm going to use leather that's this sort of thickness. Now there are at least 2 types of leather stitching, basic leather stitching, that I'm going to show you. I'm not sure if they have names or not, but if they do, I don't know them. So the first one is, say if you're making a pouch or something of that sort, you will be wanting to sew down these edges like this. I guess you could use a stitch like this for a sheath as well, so I'll do both types on the sheath as well and see what the difference is. So you'll want to hold your 2 pieces of leather together. Make sure you've tied a knot in the end of your string. Grab your bradawl, push it in, twist it. Now you will want to make sure you push the bradawl in a certain amount so that the hole is a certain width, because if you push it in too little, you won't be able to get the needle through, or it will be a right pain in doing that. So take it out again. Always twist, don't just try and yank because it won't come out. Twist it when you're pushing it in or pushing it out. So put it in and put it through, and into the hole again, and pull it tight. Not too tight, not too loose. If you're pulling it so that this bit is bending like that, you don't want that. Just make it nice and loose, but not so loose that it's literally hanging off like that. You don't want that. You want it to just sit nicely so that there's tension on it, but not too much tension. And then you get the bradawl again, in again. If you're looking to be neat, obviously you'll make sure that it's the same width between holes, but obviously it's not essential, it just looks better. In to the next hole on the same side, like that, so that comes across there, from around there, and you will get this pattern on it on one side, and into that hole again, pull it tight. There we go. So you'll notice that you've got a sort of a V shape appearing on one side and on the other, and then you just repeat that basically. There we go. So you'll see that there's more of a V shape appearing here, and here it's more double lines. And then obviously that will either hold the pouch together, or if you want to turn it inside out, you've got a nice straight thing like that without having to have the stitching on the front here inside. Although depending on what style of sewing you're doing, that's not particularly important. Now the second type, which is the type most commonly used whilst making sheaths, is similar to running stitch. Make your hole with your rattle. Again, make sure that the hole is big enough for the needle to go through. Now, turn this over because of the way that the thread's going through. Bring it around like that, and then what you want to do is double back on it. So you put it through the previous hole, and you may want to, if you've already gone through with a different type of stitch, you may want to put the bradawl through it again, just to make sure it will fit. So you come back through that hole, and again through the hole that you just made. And then do the same again, make another hole with your bradawl. Through the hole that you just made. That's not exactly straight, but it doesn't bother me because it's just a practice piece. Back through the previous hole. Through the hole you just made. And so on. Now you will notice that if you've been doing it right, the pattern of the running stitch will have one thread, two thread, one thread, two thread, and obviously on the other side it will be inverted, so two thread, one thread, two thread, one thread. Now, tying knots in the string at the end, obviously it's a lot different from tying knots when sewing, because, well, mostly because if you're using a sewing machine, then it will just tie a knot for you, probably. But when sewing with hand sewing, you need to probably tie a lot of holes. No, sorry. You tie a lot of knots in the thread to make sure that it doesn't disappear back through the hole, because the thread is very thin. But with this thread, it's quite thick, obviously, so you will only need to tie around 2 holes in it just to make sure it's secure. And again, there are 2 ways of doing this. The first one is just the basic tying 2 knots in the string. You can either take the needle off whilst you're doing this or not. Sometimes it is easier to keep the needle on, just in case you've only got a short amount. It'll make it easier for getting the string through the smaller hole in the thread. And then you tie it again. What you might want to do is hold on to the knot that you've just made whilst pulling the thread tight, because that will stop the knots from being too far away from each other. And there you go, that's 2 knots so that should keep it nice and tight. And once you've cut along here, you don't want to cut too little off, so you don't want it out here, so that's flapping around, but you don't want to cut it all the way down to there, because that will mean that the knot will just come undone. You want to have about that much, or I tend to go for around that much thread left, and then you can just brush it with your finger in random directions, which will fray out the end of the string and make it less likely to slip undone. The second type of knot works well if you're doing this type of stitching. You bring it round the stitch on the other side, so through here and through to this bit. So you bring it round in a circle like that, and you put the needle through that loop and pull it tight. That will hold the two together and make it less likely for the two knots that you're going to tie next to come undone. The two knots that you tie next are literally the same knots as we did for the first time, so just two knots in the thread. And then obviously you can take your scissors, cut off about that much, and then just fray it out a little bit. The thickness of the thread will make this easier. If it's thicker, it will be easier to fray. Like that, that will make it less likely to come undone.
To make a sheath, you'll need a piece of leather, preferably thick leather, though it doesn't have to be. And also, if it's not thick, then at least it should probably be fairly sturdy, if you know what I mean. It should hold its own. It shouldn't be more fabric type. It should be strong. The piece of leather that you need should be at least big enough to fit your scram blade on it twice, back to back, with some allowance obviously for the width of the blade, plus about a centimetre around the edge of each blade edge, if that makes any sense. It should also have a centimetre allowance at the end of the blade, either side, preferably more than a centimetre for the end, which will be not sewn up for the scram, so that it can go over the top of the end of your scram which attaches to the blade. Here are some wrong ways to position the scram, or wrong sizes of leather that could be used. So once you've got an appropriately sized piece of leather, you want to place it on one side of your leather. Place your scram on the piece of leather with the sharp or would-be sharp part of the blade in the middle of your leather. Make sure not to have the curved part or the curved side of the blade in the middle of the leather, for reasons that I will explain later. Now fold the leather piece in half at the part where the edge of the blade, the sharp edge of the blade is. Then sew around the edge of the scram, the blunt edge, as it were, of the scram. Make sure you are as close to the scram when sewing as possible, don't leave allowances. Make sure that the thread is literally as close to the scram as possible when you're sewing. You can sew over the side of each edge if you want to, but obviously don't do the type of stitch which goes over. Make sure you use running stitch, don't use the other stitch. Make sure you use running stitch, don't use the other stitch. The reason why you shouldn't sew along the sharp edge is obviously because then once you're pulling out the scram from the sheath, that blade will be constantly rubbing against the sewing thread, and because it's sharp it will eventually cut through it, breaking your sheath, and it will be useless. Once you've sewn that up, you can cut if you want to. Obviously if you've already got only a small amount you don't have to, but you can cut around the sewing and cut the excess leather off, but you'll want to leave a minimum of about 5mm around it. Then obviously you need the belt loops, so you'll want to get a piece of leather that doesn't have to be that thick, but it also probably shouldn't be too thin. Depending on the size of your scram, it should be about 1 inch wide, and lengthwise it should be 4 times the width of your sheath, so that it will fit folded in half over your sheath and still have twice the width as your scram. Make sure that the open end of the piece of leather that you're putting on for this belt loop is level, or at least on the same edge of the scram as your edge that you've sewn. Put one roughly near the rounded side of the blade, and put one fairly near the handle of the scram. Then all you need to do is sew along the line that you've already sewn on the edge in order to sew these 2 loops in place, and then sew along the top of the sheath so that the belt loops aren't flapping about. If you sew along this top part there, it will keep them in place, and there you have your finished sheath.